The economic map of Canada is being redrawn as you watch this. Not by politicians you elected, not by a referendum you voted in, but by decisions happening right now in boardrooms in Calgary, investment committees in Singapore, and contract negotiations in Tokyo. Over $200 billion in infrastructure with well over $100 billion in capital is already committed. Pipelines to the Pacific, mining corridors in the Arctic, transmission lines across the prairies, projects that will define Canada's economy for the next 50 years. And here's what nobody's talking about. By the time most Canadians even hear about these projects, the capital is committed, the contracts are signed, and changing course would cost billions. This isn't a conspiracy. It's how modern infrastructure works. But it raises one uncomfortable question. If these decisions shape the next 50 years, who carries the risk when the bets are wrong? Investors or taxpayers? So let's break down the $200 billion rebuild happening right now. Who's really calling the shots, and why Canada's geography makes this almost impossible to stop. If you want to see the rebuild in real time, start at Tidewater. Right now, Canada is completing some of the biggest energy export corridors in its history. Pipelines and ports are built on contracts that run for decades. Let's start with LNG Canada in Kitimat, British Columbia. A liquefied natural gas project is commonly cited at around $40 billion, described as the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. Phase 1 has now entered operation. On June 30th, 2025, LNG Canada loaded its first export cargo in Kitimat, officially putting Canada on the map of large-scale LNG exporters. That first shipment sailed to South Korea, marking Canada's formal entry into the global LNG export market. Subsequent tankers headed to Japan and other Asian ports. The joint venture partners, Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Kogas, are positioning LNG Canada as a long-term supplier to Asia. The economics lean on long-term contracts with Asian utilities and the shorter shipping distance from northern BC to North Asia compared with the US Gulf Coast. Feeding LNG Canada is the 670-kilometer coastal GasLink pipeline from near Dawson Creek to Kitimat. The line crosses the Rocky Mountain foothills, multiple rivers, and several indigenous territories. Most prominently, the Wet'suwet'en, where hereditary chiefs opposed a project that some elected band councils supported. Initial cost expectations were in the single-digit billions, but cost overruns pushed the final bill into the mid-teens of billions of dollars. Despite protests, blockades, and international criticism, construction moved forward. Why? Because the LNG export plans and offtake agreements were already embedded in corporate strategies and global supply assumptions. The pipeline exists because international LNG contracts required a path to Tidewater. Regulators could shape the route, but they weren't the ones signing the sales contracts that now tie BC gas to Asian buyers. Now let's move south. The Trans Mountain Expansion, or TMX, takes a legacy oil pipeline from Edmonton to the BC Lower Mainland and nearly triples its capacity from about 300,000 barrels per day to roughly 890,000 barrels per day. After years of court cases and the federal government buying the project, the expanded line entered commercial service in May 2024. Official estimates now peg the project cost at about $34 billion, with some analyses suggesting the all-in burden for the public sector could approach the $40 to $50 billion. From Alberta's perspective, the logic is straightforward. Without access to Tidewater and global buyers, Canadian heavy oil sells at a discount into a mostly US market. But here's what most people don't realize. Even with the expansion only recently in service, Trans Mountain is already studying optimization projects to move more oil through the same corridor. The company describes a staged approach. First, using drag-reducing agents that could lift throughput by roughly 50,000 to 85,000 barrels per day. Then, potentially adding pumping power that could push capacity to around 1.1 to 1.14 million barrels per day by the late 2020s. Again, Those choices are being made in corporate plans and regulator filings, not by putting the pipeline's next expansion on a ballot. On the Atlantic coast, a new cluster of projects is trying to turn eastern Canada into an energy gateway to Europe. These range from LNG export proposals to large green hydrogen projects like World Energy GH2's $12 billion build-out in Newfoundland and Labrador, combining onshore wind with hydrogen and ammonia production for export. Germany and other European countries looking to replace Russian gas have signed early-stage agreements with Canadian partners connected to these projects. Taken together, LNG Canada and its pipeline, TMX and its optimization, and the Atlantic hydrogen proposals represent on the order of $95 to $110 billion plus in export gateway infrastructure. They lock in Canada's role as a major energy exporter for decades to come. But energy exports are only one side of the story. Before we go deeper, if this is the kind of geoeconomic story you want more of, projects, corridors, choke points, and who actually benefits, like this video and subscribe, because we will be covering more of these types of stories. The second unseen hand is geopolitical rivalry over critical minerals. China now dominates large parts of the processing chain, controlling around 90% of global rare earth processing and very high shares in refining for other key minerals. These materials, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, nickel, are the guts of batteries, EVs, wind turbines, and advanced military systems. For Western governments, relying on one rival power for that processing has shifted from an economic curiosity to a strategic vulnerability. Canada hosts significant deposits across Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the territories. For years, many were too remote to develop. But higher prices, supply chain fears, and public incentives have changed the equation. Let's start with the Ring of Fire, a remote mineral region in northern Ontario, roughly 500 to 600 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. It contains chromite, nickel, copper, and other metals, with the total mineral value estimated at over $60 billion. The catch is access. There is no permanent highway into the core of the Ring of Fire, only winter roads and air service. Ontario-commissioned work suggests that roads and related infrastructure will cost in the low single-digit billions, with estimates around $1.6 billion for roads and $2.4 billion total, including power and telecom. Those routes have to cross wetlands, rivers, and multiple First Nations territories. So the real project is not just a road, but a new resource corridor. Now let's move to Nunavut. The territory holds some of Canada's richest untapped mineral potential, from iron ore at Mary River to gold and possible rare earth sites. At Mary River, Baffinland already operates a private industrial corridor, more than 100 kilometers of haul road from the mine to a port at Milne Inlet, with seasonal shipping windows. Expansion concepts have envisioned longer shipping seasons, new rail segments, and production ramp-ups toward 12 to 18 million tons of ore per year, with capital spending in the multi-billion-dollar range. The net result is de facto deep water port and corridor construction in the eastern Arctic, shaped primarily by private finance and global commodity demand. Then there's the Northwest Territories, hosting deposits of tungsten, rare earths, and potential lithium. Projects like the Nechalacho rare earth mine highlight a key bottleneck. Getting ore out is one thing. Building processing capacity is another. One emerging model is to do initial processing in the NWT and then ship concentrates to specialized refineries in southern Canada. Across northern Canada, proposed mineral corridors and processing facilities add up to an estimated $15 to $20 billion. Plus, when you combine the Ring of Fire, Nunavut corridors, and NWT-linked projects. Those investments are being pulled forward by security-minded Western governments trying to diversify away from Chinese processing, investment funds hunting long-term supply, and mining companies signing agreements with battery makers and automakers. But none of this works without something much less visible: the wires that actually move clean power around the country. Canada has legally committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and a net zero electricity grid by 2035. That means phasing out coal-fired power by 2030, including in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. There's a structural problem. Canada doesn't have a single deeply integrated national grid. It has provincial systems with patchy interconnections, especially between Quebec, the Maritimes, and the Prairies. In the 20th century, provinces built generation close to their own cities. In the 21st century, the best zero-carbon resources are often far away. Big hydro in Labrador and Quebec, wind across the prairies. The energy is there, but in the wrong place. That's where the climate mandate starts quietly rearranging the power architecture. The original Atlantic Loop idea was a multi-billion-dollar transmission network to move clean hydro from Quebec and Labrador into Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to replace coal. Early estimates clustered around $6 to $7 billion. As costs rose and politics shifted, that grand loop shrank into more modest links, most notably a scaled-down connection between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia Power now pegs that line around $700 million. Why does that matter? Because Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have committed to phasing out coal by 2030, but they can't fully replace that capacity with local renewables on their own. So transmission becomes the real bottleneck. Underwater cables, long lines through rural territories, and new substations that decide who gets access to clean power. And again, no national ballot question. These decisions move through federal-provincial negotiations, utility boards, and environmental assessments. Now, the prairies. Southern Alberta and Saskatchewan are Canada's wind powerhouse. But Alberta's grid has been relatively isolated, and Saskatchewan's connections into Manitoba's hydro system have been limited. When wind generation spikes, that power often has nowhere to go. So turbines get curtailed and electrons are stranded. A suite of intertie upgrades, Alberta-Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan-Manitoba, and potential improvements toward BC aims to change that, with capital requirements in the low single-digit billions. The goal is simple but transformative. Unlock the geography. Wind farms can then feed mines, cities, and industries hundreds of kilometers away instead of hitting a local wall. Put the Atlantic transmission links and Prairie interties together, and you get something like $7 to $13 billion of major grid-shaping projects over the next decade. Across these three hands, a pattern emerges. Climate commitments are forcing a rewired grid. Geopolitical rivalry is pulling critical mineral infrastructure into serious planning. And long-term trade contracts are driving enormous export terminals and pipelines on both coasts. If you stack up the big projects in those three categories, you arrive at a rough total in the low hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 to 15 years. Once you add the quieter pieces, regional lines, port and rail upgrades, indigenous infrastructure, and new industrial sites, the overall rebuild plausibly clears the $200 billion mark. None of that was packaged as a single question on a ballot. Instead, it flows through regulatory processes, investment decisions, and international contracts that move on decade-long timelines while federal elections come and go every 4 years. By the time most Canadians hear about these projects, the capital is committed. The contracts are signed, and changing course would carry enormous financial and diplomatic costs. This rebuild will decide which regions surge and which struggle, whether Canada climbs the value chain or stays a raw resource supplier, and how much geopolitical leverage the country actually has. It's a $200 billion redraw of Canada's economic geography happening mostly beyond the ballot box, filtered through regulators, utility boards, cabinet decisions, and international contracts rather than a single clear yes or no vote. If this changed how you see Canada's economic future, consider subscribing. We're going to keep unpacking the geography and economics behind the projects reshaping the country right now.